Welcome to the Engineering Influence podcast presented by the American Council of Engineering Companies. M&A is a popular issue on the podcast, and today we're going to come at it from a different angle. Rather than looking at the state of the market or the various valuation methods, we're going to talk about the role of key people in the firm. Diving into this issue with us is Robert Gabel, a former CFO at two mid-sized engineering firms who has been involved in numerous acquisitions and as well has been involved in several decisions not to make the acquisition. He also was involved in rebuilding two ownership transition programs and has advised on several more. Bob recently presented an online class for ACEC on the people side of M&A. And if our conversation stimulates your interest, I encourage you to download the program. We'll put a link in the show notes. Bob, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jerry.
Before we get started, why don't you sort of set the stage for us about what the issue is?
So, Jerry, our focus discussion will be around M&A and ownership transition in general. So M&A is one type of ownership transition when you sell to a third party. Another common issue that people are concerned about is selling within the firm, to selling to the next generation. So the issues are very similar in terms of both conditions need a future generation of leaders to be developed and nurtured to be successful. The other thing I wanted to do was define a few terms that we'll be using through this discussion to make sure everybody's on the same page. We'll talk about leadership and leaders. So I wanted to just share my thoughts on leadership. And to me, the leaders are the key decision makers and thought leaders of a company. And I put the leaders into 5 categories. You can have strategic leaders, you can have client relationship leaders, technical experts, project delivery, administrative leaders. They're up and down the organization. So you might have a project manager who is leader of his peers, as well as it's not just the C-level suite that we're talking about. The definition of owners to me is are employees who have a financial stake significant enough to affect how they think about the firm and are empowered to influence and contribute to the direction of the firm. So owners are different from investors because owners impact the outcome. Investors are passive, like investing in the stock market. Owners are a synthesis, basically, of leaders and owners. So leaders and investors, the synthesis becomes an owner.
So in a firm, you don't basically have to be an owner to be a leader. You can be a leader without being an owner.
Yes, you can. And we'll get to this discussion as part of the discussion. In the AEC world, if you're employee owned, most AEC firms want to align that leadership and ownership and then we'll talk about the skin in the game mentality to help people focus their decisions.
And I listened to your program, and at one point you said leaders drive the value in the firm. Is that a fair idea?
I think so, because whether you're going to sell a firm or run the firm where it is today, or turn it over to the next generation, this generation, the current generation of leaders, are the ones that are out there with the clients. They're executing the projects, they're setting the strategy. They're the ones that really drive the value, because then you have that staff level that executes under that leadership, and they need that direction to execute, to know what to execute and how to execute efficiently for your firm. The future leaders, so if you're going to sell your firm in an M&A, or if you're going to buy a firm, you'd be interested in who the future leaders are. If you're going to buy a firm when your leadership is, let's say, on the back end of their career, who's going to drive that future profitability? Is that next generation? So that's why it's important for the current leaders to always be developing that next generation of leaders. And so if I'm selling, that's what the buyers are buying. If I'm buying, I want to know not who's contributing, but is going to be leaving the firm in the next 3 to 5 years. Who's going to be able to drive that value for the next 10 or 15 years? So I get my return on investment.
So does that mean that you need to as a firm owner, potentially selling or buying, that you need to bring these future leaders into the discussion early on in the process?
I find that's most helpful. I'll tell you a little story about some advice I did on ownership transition plans. And I would go and somebody would talk about their ownership transition plan and ask me what I think about it. And my first question is always, have you talked to the people you want to sell to see what their interests are? And usually that ends the conversation. They say, oh, I guess I better do that. Because they may not be interested in buying the firm. They may have asked of things for the ownership transition program that you didn't think about. So there'll be some compromise if it's internal ownership transition. If you're looking to sell through an M&A process, if they're not interested in working for another type of firm or the firm that you're trying to sell to, there'll be some disruption and they'll probably leave that other firm. You know, they might have some golden handcuffs, maybe a 3-year employment agreement, but if they're not happy, they're not going to be productive. And if they don't have an employment agreement, they'll go someplace where they're happy. So that will destroy value for the acquisition, reflect poorly on you, and may even affect how you get paid if you have a pay for performance, an earnout. So getting that alignment of what you want to do with the firm with that next generation of leaders is critical to have their buy-in and get everybody on the same page so you're rowing in the same direction. If you have that lack of conversation, there's discord and there'll be disruptions down the line in your plans to turn over ownership, whichever way you go, internal or through an M&A.
And some leaders, I would assume, don't want to be owners, don't want to run the show. They just want to keep doing the stuff that they do.
So there's come at this question in a couple of different angles. One is there's great investment advice out there. Says don't invest in where you work because you're putting too many of your eggs in one basket. And that's great investment advice, but we're talking about owners, not investors. So to me, owners are making a great impact in how the investment turns out. So it makes a big difference. Whenever somebody brings that up, I ask them, well, how'd that work out for Bill Gates? He invested where he worked and it worked out real well. Now, we're not always going to do as well Bill Gates did, but that's the concept. If you can influence the outcome, I think that investment advice needs to be altered and rethought. The other side is owners are risk takers. They have to have confidence themselves to take risk and calibrate the risk and return. Is this a risk that I can manage and has a good chance of succeeding? Because they've got their own money on it, they have a lot more focus on that risk reward, and is the risk they're taking aligned with how they want to put their money at risk. Some managers don't want to put their own money at risk. They have maybe they're more risk averse than the company as a whole, and don't want to make those ownership decisions. Interestingly, they live with the risk of somebody else's decision, but they typically don't see it that way. These could be very good managers. I mean, large public firms has whole suites of managers who are more comfortable working for a firm the way they don't have to be an owner, and they don't have to align their leadership with ownership. And it takes different personalities, but if you're in a model where you are privately owned by your employees, I think you have a limited source of capital. It's really best to align that leadership and ownership. Get the people to have the skin in the game that helps their focus on risk and decisions and what is the best strategy for the outcome of the firm, not necessarily, and get beyond decisions, what's the best outcome for them personally.
On sort of keeping, getting that alignment, is this a multi-year process? Is this something you would start doing 10 years before perhaps there was a change, or is it less, more?
I find it best if it's an ongoing process. Ownership transition is not an event. It's continuous. If you can see it as, okay, the founder sold to the next generation, but you always need to be developing that next tier of leadership. And leadership, as we talked about before, is tiered. You have the C-level suites, you have the managers underneath them, and you have the up and coming people you've hired that you really think they're great and they have a lot of potential. You've got to be bringing them along, each at their own level, to get them to the next stage. The other thing I like to see, and I think has seen work very well, is develop a large pool of junior leaders so that you have a larger pool for the senior leaders to evolve from. Because if somebody's in their mid-20s and 30s, it's hard to identify who's going to be the, are they the right person to become a CFO or CEO or COO? It takes time for people to mature, evolve, and you can't pick the right person when you hire them in their beginning of their career. They have to prove themselves, give them opportunities to succeed and fail, hopefully fail small, but people learn more from failure than they do from success. So you have to nurture them along, give them success, and give them opportunities to make those successes and failures and learn and develop into that future leader. Very rarely are you born into it. Maybe some family transitions happen that way, but usually not internal transitions or developing a leadership model.
I would assume that sort of works on the other side too, that by giving potential future leaders opportunities, you are cementing them to the firm at a more than you would if you just sort of had them do normal tasks.
So true leaders will find an organization where they're able to achieve their potential. And if they feel like they're being held back, we've all seen that, they'll start looking out to the market and find a position someplace where they don't feel lined back, where they feel that they've been empowered to the level that they think that they're ready to take that leadership. So yes, you have to keep feeding them and building up that leadership. But the rewards of that are that's what drives the profitability of your company and success of your firm. Is if it's a client development leader, you're getting more clients in and more good clients. If it's a project delivery, you're executing your projects at a higher margin and more successful, on time and on scope and on budget. All those leadership contributions have to happen at all levels, and you have to continually push those real true leaders up to the next level by challenging them, because otherwise they'll go somewhere else where they can achieve their own potential.
If we move along the timeline a bit and move to when the actual discussions start coming about purchasing the firm or passing ownership shares to future leaders, and you made this point in the program, was that a lot of owners want to dictate terms because they're used to that. They're the founder, and and you made the point that that's not the way to go walk into a negotiation.
Yeah, the owners, especially the founders are in a unique position, but owners, the current leadership, they're making the decisions. They feel empowered. They feel like they're driving the organization. But this developing the next leadership level and aligning your goals so that you're taking the company where your next leaders want to go, if you want to sell to a third party or they want to buy, or what markets do you want to do? Do they want to grow faster? Do they want to grow slower? Do they want to expand into new technologies? The owners feel like they can dictate the terms, and then they go talk to someone. As I talked about before, if you haven't talked to these people, how do you know your goals are aligned with their goals? You go and propose, yeah, I want to, Jerry, I want you to go down and open up the markets in the Southeast. Jerry says, hey, I've got family and friends up here in DC. I don't want to move to Atlanta. So you start talking and then say, well, the issue is that the next generation leaders always have the option to not engage. So if I gave you a proposition that says you have to move to Atlanta, and you say, well, no, I don't. If I could go somewhere else, you always have that option to not engage in my plans. So you actually have as much power, maybe more power than me as the owner who's trying to drive the program. So getting together, talking about it, listening to your goals, you listening to mine, and maybe some compromise in between. Maybe you're willing to do 5 years in Atlanta to help get things started, but a promise to come back to DC where you live. So both sides will need to compromise if they're really committed to making the relationship work. It can't be one side dictating the other, because you'll feel disempowered, and if I start pushing around, you say, well, I'm not enjoying my work here anymore because I don't feel empowered, and my boss isn't listening to me, and I need to go somewhere where I feel more comfortable in doing my work every day.
One of the issues we hear a lot about is that the younger generation, well, people say they don't want to be owners, but one of the issues is that they don't tend to have the equity. They don't tend to have the money to invest in the firm. And one way to get around that is just to grant them shares in the firm. But getting back to your statement about having skin in the game, that sort of, they don't really have skin in the game at that point, do they?
I don't think they do. And I think that granting shares, to me, is not a good idea. There are firms that work on that model. If I grant you shares, you're very happy about receiving this share bonus, but you didn't put your own skin in the game. So now it's just a gift. Now, I might have given it to you to help the ownership transition. I might have done it to avoid having to engage with you on what your goals were. I see that a lot. It's like, well, if I give you the shares, I don't have to ask you what your goals are to entice you to buy them, because who's going to turn down free money? One of the risks is if we haven't aligned our goals and our interests, you could take the shares, get invested, and say, well, I'm going to go someplace where I am aligned with the direction of the company. So then you sell your shares, the company's out both your leadership and the money that we handed off to you. The other risk, so you have the skin in the game risk, you have the alignment of interests. The other risk is that the model seems to create some stress on capitalization for the firm. If I grant the shares to you, and then you mature in your ownership at the end, you want to sell them back, and I buy them back, it's a one-way flow of capital. I'm buying out your shares, but you didn't buy in. So the capital is one-way flow, and it really puts a lot of stress on capitalization of the firm. You may be able to get through it with 1 or 2 generations of ownership transition, but I've seen a number of firms that have not being able to sustain that for very long. And you can understand why. If I'm consuming all my capital to buy out owners who didn't buy in, and I don't have a source of capital to replace that, it's going to put a lot of stress on the organization.
So when it does come time to negotiate the sale, the key, it seems to me, would be that you, as you've mentioned several times, you need to align the goals of the buyer and the seller, not just on the direction of the firm, but on the financial aspects of the transaction.
Yes, usually the strategic level and the large owners are focused on the financial side. The buyers are going to be focused on who that next generation is and who's going to really drive the profitability in the next few years. And that's why, if I'm the seller, I've got to get everybody aligned. I've got to get my next generation on board and properly rewarded in the transaction. So they may get a piece of the sale proceeds, even if they're not owners, or they may get an employment agreement or some sort of performance bonus agreement. So there are ways to transfer value, a whole sort of varieties, and the lawyers and the transaction people who can invent lots of those things. But aligning those interests of the next generation, the current owners, and the buyers is critical. So now if you're doing an M&A, you've got three parties to align, whereas if you do an internal transaction, there's the current ownership group and the next generation that you're aligning. And again, if I don't talk to the next generation and I'm selling the company, the buyer is well served to talk to the next generation, make sure they buy in. But if they don't, they've got a severe risk that that next generation is not aligned. Most people really, really value their people who have made them successful. They really want to reward them when they sell the firm. So their interest is doing that, but they don't always think about going and talking to them and getting their view on a potential transaction or what type of firm you want to sell to. You want to sell to very large firms where you can have this great diversity, you work on huge projects, or you want to sell to a mid-sized firm where you can have a greater influence on the direction of the company. People have different interests in life. That's what makes life so wonderful, that everybody has different interests, but you really ought to align. You can align who you market your firm to the interests of the next generation, so they benefit and get rewarded for all the value that they've provided to you in your current ownership.
Closing up here, would it be fair to say that you have the selling generation, and then there's the buying generation, which is younger, perhaps, but then there's the next generation below that, which is, I think you termed them earlier, the 10 to 15 year leaders, the ones who won't be there for another, 10 to 15 years. And those, it would seem to me, that's where the value in the company probably is, isn't it? It's in those people.
So yes.
Do you need to bring them into the conversation as well?
So if I'm selling internally, I'm probably selling to people who have another 10 or 15 years in their career. They need time to, if you could sell to somebody with 2 or 3 years left in their career, they're not going to feel empowered to really make their mark and try the things that they want to do. They need time to be able to execute a plan to get into a new territory, or I want to get into structural engineering, and I've never done structural engineering, but I want to extend our product services into new areas. It takes time to do that, to get successful. So I see the next generation as being that 10 to 15. And then the 15 to 20-year-olds, you're nurturing and getting them lined up. And that's that deep pool I was talking about before. So those leaders evolve, and they're the next generation of owners. And we talk about generations, but it's a continuous process. In the firms I was running, there's the baby boomers view of the generation. There was a whole bunch of us who bought our shares, grew up, and then sold, and it's a big bubble. But it's a continuous, every year we're buying and selling shares. So it's a continuous process. We kind of think in terms of generations, but it's every year there's new people coming in and people retiring or leaving the company one way or the other. You need to have the future. You need to have those 10 to 15 year people, because they've got the experience to drive the organization. They have the experience to make good risk decisions to allow the company to thrive into the future. And if you want to sell to your current employees, it's usually you want to keep that legacy alive because you're proud of what you built. That's usually part of the consideration. And if you're selling to a third party, they want to make sure that they get their ROI, and it may affect your buyout, your earnout. But I tend to think of it in 3 different tiers: the current generation, the current owners who are on the sell path, the 10 to 15 years who are the next generation going to drive the success. And then there's the junior leaders, who need to be nurtured and given opportunities to see what their capabilities are and help them learn to be leaders for the next generation, the third generation.
Well, great. I think that's wraps it up. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Jerry, thank you for asking me to join you. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm open to helping any of your audience if they want to reach out to me.
Will do. We've been talking with Bob Gabel, and this has been the Engineering Influence Podcast presented by ACEC.